Let me start by calling on Joseph Gerson, President of Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security in the United States.
As an American long involved in the U.S. peace movement, I need to begin by saying that my heart broke in much the same way that Ann Wright's heart broke listening to the talks this morning. Hearing the testimonies of the Japanese, the Korean, the Marshall Islands, Hiroshima, and the Vietnamese. Unfortunately, the truth is that the government that speaks in my name has never acknowledged or confronted some of the world's worst crimes against humanity ever committed. And those of us in the United States have to work under that cloud. I've had the extraordinary privilege over the years of working with Japanese and other atomic and hydrogen bomb survivors. They've endured and transformed the worst imaginable physical and emotional traumas into the most influential force for nuclear weapons abolition. Their fundamental call is that human beings and nuclear weapons cannot coexist. Their courage, their call, and their steadfast advocacy of nuclear weapons abolition earned them the Nobel Peace Prize last December. In awarding the Hiroshima the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Committee sent the world a powerful message. The world is closer to catastrophic nuclear war than it has ever been, and we must act now for nuclear weapons abolition. It was thrilling in Oslo to see these men and women being recognized and honored. There were also feelings of sadness as I thought about Yamaguchi Senji, Taniguchi Sumitero, Watanabe Chieto, and other courageous Hidankyo leaders who did not live to enjoy the recognition and the international platform that they so rightly deserved. They do live on and inspire us as we remember them. That said, let me share some terrible, if not surprising news. Even as we celebrate Hiroshima's courage and achievements, we face an increasingly dangerous world. As Antonio Gramsci wrote, quote, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." Among them, Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu. The dangers of the disorienting tectonic geopolitical changes marked by the rise of China and the global south, as well as the decline of the West, are compounding our situation. Oops, my paper just got funny here. In the U.S., so we know that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists told us how dangerous the situation is when they move the hands of the doomsday clock to 80 seconds to midnight, the closest ever to annihilation. In the U.S., Trump's counter-revolutionary Big Brutal Bill imposes record-setting transfer of wealth from the poor and working classes to the super-rich. It also includes an additional $150 billion for the military. The now trillion-dollar military budget includes roughly $300 billion a year for new nuclear weapons and the delivery systems designed to end all life as we know it. With Trump and Secretary of State Rubio focused on tariffs, deportations, Eldridge Colby, the grandson of the former CIA director, is driving U.S. foreign and military policies. NATO nations have been forced to increase and in some cases double their military spending. NATO Secretary General Rutte stated that this is being done so the U.S. can reduce its European commitments in order to continue building up its forces in Japan and across the Indo-Pacific, and its now self-defeating campaign to contain China. While the Indo-Pacific alliances are reminiscent of those that preceded World War I, and incidents, accidents, and miscalculations in the South and East China Seas could trigger escalation, even nuclear war, Taiwan remains the hinge of the U.S. Indo-Pacific imperial power and lies at the vortex of U.S.-Japanese against Chinese ambitions and confrontations. The truth is that Taiwan cannot be defended militarily, and a military conflict there is most likely to trigger for an homicidal nuclear war. Putin and Trump have undermined the UN Charter system with their wars in Ukraine and Iran, as well as by U.S. complicity in Israel's Gaza genocide. As Malaysia's foreign minister warned, Trump's bombing of Iran's nuclear infrastructure crossed an essential red line, and it is likely to spur nuclear weapons proliferation. At home, Trump's white supremacist rule aims to end constitutional democracy. In communities across the U.S., masked Gestapo-like Trump ICE police kidnap our immigrant neighbors and ship them to Guantanamo and other gulags, including El Salvador, and the South Sudan. In the tradition of dictators, our universities, press, and science are under attack. Our ignorant president is illegally inflicting punishing tariffs reminiscent of the 1930s Great Depression. And between Trump's re-embrace of fossil fuels and the new Cold War confrontation with China, the urgent need to address the existential dangers of climate change are being abandoned. But the reality is the Pax Americana is truly over. But the situation in the U.S. is not entirely bleak. Democratic values and culture and commitments to human rights have asserted themselves as millions of people have come out into the streets to say no kings, stop ISIS terrorism, and fund healthcare and education, not warfare. In June, while Trump celebrated his birthday with a poorly attended military parade, 1 million people turned out in Boston to march against the Trump agenda. Vigils outside of ICE detention centers are growing. Trump is being challenged in the courts, and mobilization is underway to oust the dictatorial MAGA forces in the 2026 congressional elections. And across the country, people are rededicating themselves to the struggle for a nuclear weapons-free world as they commemorate this 80th Hiroshima and Nagasaki anniversary. Just over 12,000 nuclear weapons remain in the nuclear arsenals, 93% by Russia and the United States. The average strategic bombs are 20 times more powerful than the Hiroshima A-bombs. Those first bombs killed 210,000 people almost immediately. Hundreds of thousands more died from radiation diseases in the years and decades that followed. We now know that a relatively small nuclear exchange of 50 to 100 nuclear weapons would almost immediately kill millions of people. Their smoke and fires would create global cooling in the northern hemisphere, leading to crop failures and the deaths of an estimated 2 billion people. As we learned from Hiroshima, the A-bomb Casualty Commission and the 4.1 program abused survivors as guinea pigs. Initially, I found this difficult to believe, that the U.S. government had reached that level of evil. But 25 years ago, I arranged a meeting between Hiroshima and the U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Department of Energy, the man responsible for all the human impacts of radiation studies. When I asked if he could deny the guinea pigs charge, he answered, this is a quote, "Oh no, we've used those studies for everything, including the design of new nuclear weapons." This is evil on par with Dr. Mengele's murderous Nazi medical experiments on Jews and of Japan's wartime 731 experiments in China. I have to apologize for the rest of my speech. I'm sorry. In order to make the most of this 80th anniversary, we need to understand, address, and expose the imperial and deterrence logics that drive today's multi-trillion-dollar nuclear arms races. Daniel Ellsberg, the principal author of President Kennedy's and Johnson's nuclear warfighting doctrines, testified that the U.S. repeatedly threatened to initiate nuclear war during wars and international crises. Presidents, he said, use them in the same way that an armed robber uses a gun, when pointing at the victim's head. Whether or not the trigger is pulled, the gun has been used. U.S. presidents have done this at least 30 times to enforce its Middle East, Indo-Pacific, and other hegemony. And each of the other nuclear powers has done so at least once. The ideological foundation for nuclear annihilation preparations is deterrence theory, which works until it doesn't. Numerous U.S. military officials have stated that deterrence has never been U.S. policy. Years ago, when the Bush-Cheney administration was developing its doctrine for joint nuclear operations, its initial draft stated that, quote, "The focus of U.S. deterrence efforts is to influence adversaries to withhold actions intended to harm U.S. national interests. This is not limited to preventing nuclear attacks against the U.S. It includes control of our oil under their sands, or to prevent others from intervening to protect those Washington is determined to attack. This is what Putin is doing in Ukraine." Now to the NPT, one of the seminal treaties of the 20th century, for which there will be a major review conference next year. In the 1960s, Washington and Moscow recognized that the science for creating nuclear weapons was no longer beyond the reach of many other countries. They feared that as many as 40 countries could develop nuclear weapons by the end of the century. The treaty they negotiated with the vast majority of the world's nations rests on three pillars. Nuclear weapons states forswore becoming nuclear powers, but they've got the right to develop and use nuclear power for peaceful purposes, a flaw in the treaty. Article 6 obliges the nuclear powers to engage in good faith negotiations for the complete elimination of their nuclear weapons, the obligation that they have resisted now for 50 years. Counterproductively, Trump and Netanyahu's war on Iran undermines the NPT and may hasten Tehran in deciding to become a nuclear weapons state. And this would trigger nuclear weapons proliferation across the Middle East. But diplomacy, not war, was and remains the way to respond. Jumping through here. As many feared, the Iranian government moved fissile material from the Natanz and Fordo facilities before these attacks. Contrary to President Trump's claim that he obliterated Iran's nuclear project and his disgusting assertion that the bombing was equivalent to the Hiroshima A bombing, the Pentagon reports that they do not know how much or where enriched uranium has been moved. Rafael Grossi of the IAEA confirmed that Iran can resume enrichment within months. Even as Trump and Netanyahu threaten possible future attacks if Iran resuscitates its nuclear program, their attacks are already spurring nuclear weapons proliferation. Knowledge of how to build a nuclear weapon was not eliminated. And building from the lessons of Ukraine and Libya, which were invaded after they surrendered their nuclear weapons programs, there is now greater incentive for Iran and other nations to adopt the lesson that sovereignty and independence require retaliatory nuclear arsenals, as was the case with North Korea. Add to that, the majority of South Koreans favored their government possessing nuclear weapons, as they fear being left to confront North Korea on their own. And here in Japan, the SDF has long asserted that the Constitution gives it the right to possess nuclear weapons. As one senior SDF officer told me many years ago, it is simply a right they have chosen not yet to exercise. It is the Japanese peace movement, I need to stress this, the Japanese peace movement that has held the SDF in check. Let me close with lessons from several more Nobel Peace Prize recipients. Joseph Rotblat, the only senior scientist who resigned from the Manhattan Project due to his moral considerations, also issued a profound warning. He said, because no nation will long tolerate what it experiences an unjust imbalance of power, in this case terror, if nuclear weapons are not abolished, proliferation and nuclear war will inevitably follow. Mohammed El-Baradei, who led the IAEA, put it differently, decrying the nuclear double standard as nuclear apartheid. Like Rotblat, he insisted that the only way forward was nuclear weapons abolition. Friends, as a college student, I volunteered with Martin Luther King's last campaign. That was a hard time for the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and for the country as a whole. When I questioned one of the senior King strategists about the perilous situation, he answered with a baseball analogy. When your team is behind and it is the ninth inning with 2 outs, you do everything you can to overcome. In this situation, in addition to our struggle in the U.S. to preserve constitutional democracy and to defend our neighbors, peace and justice activists and some members of Congress are pressing the Back from the Brink campaign. It calls for nuclear weapons abolition and halting the $2 trillion spending for a new nuclear arsenal. For no first strike policy in the world. As we mark the 80th anniversary of the A bombings here in Hiroshima, people are organizing commemorations across the U.S. Perhaps the biggest will be in my hometown of Boston. There will also be a protest at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in California. The Arms Control Association is launching a new call to halt and reverse the arms race. And the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World is organizing a major signature drive which was presented to the Japanese consulate on August the 6th. I guess the last thing I want to say before concluding is to call your attention to a full-page signature ad that will be in the Boston Globe on August the 6th. It expresses our remorse and anger and shame over the atomic bombings and urges the abolition of nuclear weapons. I'm happy to say that people decided to contribute to help pay for it, and we've raised more money than the advertisement will proceed. We now see that the majority of young people in the United States believe that the A bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were wrong, and now it's a challenge to us to mobilize that opposition and to end the U.S. commitment to nuclear weapons and possible nuclear war. Don't worry, guys. Excuse me, it's maybe inappropriate for a chair to be responding to Thomas. But what I want to say is, at this point, it is not about arguments. It's about whether we can create the political power that forces the governments to change. That means organizing. It means taking risks. It means doing unusual things to build the mass movements we need to turn the governments around. We have the arguments. We need the power. As I was thinking still about the question of the use of weapons of mass destruction, the devastation of Gaza, and what that means. As an American Jew who was born immediately after the Holocaust, watching what Israel has done has been mind-boggling. A total violation of what should have been the lessons of the Holocaust, of never again, and the idea of wiping out entire people. It's almost the reverse, and it's a horror. I watched what's happening in Gaza very much like the Warsaw Ghetto, and the need to resist. When I was young, I had a professor who talked about punishment in response to crime. And he said there were three kinds. One is in the short term. If I hit a woman here, she'll hit me back. Immediate response. If I rob a bank, I'll maybe go to prison for some time. But if I do something like enslaving millions of Africans, or the Vietnam War, or Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the consequences of that will be over a very long time. The punishment is inevitable, one way or another. And we now have a situation where Israel is a pariah state. In the United States, people who refuse to think about the apartheid, the Israeli apartheid, are now beginning to question the legitimacy of Israel's survival as a nation over time. So, the same in many ways applies to the incredible war crimes of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki A bombings and the preparations for the annihilation of nuclear weapons. And we see this in the way that the world, through the TPNW, is responding. And the reality is that international law and respect for humanity will only prevail if we insist that it prevail. And from each of our countries, we will find ways to do that. Certainly, some years ago, I suggested that one thing the world could do to isolate the United States from its nuclear weapons was to boycott Walt Disney and Mickey Mouse. We need to use our imaginations to surround us, as I learned when I first came here years ago, to surround and isolate the nuclear weapons states. Israel is certainly being surrounded and isolated, and hopefully these countries and these people will learn from it. I'm sorry. The alliance structure, in one way, has been imposed for a very long time as a result of U.S. imperialism. And what we see now is the relative decline of U.S. power, and so therefore the effort to compensate by increasing the number of its alliances. We saw this especially under Biden when they created what they called a lattice work of alliances. And clearly they're a way for control. They're a desperate effort to try to hold on to U.S. Indo-Pacific hegemony. But of course there are contradictions. There are always contradictions. And we have the arrogance, the unbelievable arrogance, in part based on racism, of Trump and MAGA. The idea that white Christian Americans have the right and responsibility to dominate the world. And this doesn't work. You have a story here. As Trump came to power the second time, in a confidential conversation, I think the former number 3 figure in the Pentagon was asked, what is the principal foreign policy and military policy goal of the Trump administration? And the answer he gave was his first priority, maybe his second and third priorities, are to enrich himself and his family. And this reflects the corruption that we're seeing and some of the side deals being made through the tariffs. But clearly, the period of acceptance of U.S. hegemony is passing. There is definitely we have the U.S. Japan-Korea alliance, which is being challenged, reinforced for the near term, but look too at the divisions here in Japan politically, which will impact it. We have resistance across the global south to the U.S. imperial structure of alliances. So it's here for the time. It's a desperate effort to reinforce U.S. power for the coming time. It's the arrogance of the idea of white Christian imperialism, but that's going to pass. The period, as I said, of Pax America is over, and the reality too is that with the collapse of structures that have existed now for 80 years, or in the case of the Philippines, let's say since 1898, there's clearly confusion, there's reorganization, there's sometimes violence, but we're going through this period of massive reorganization of global security and insecurity relations.